to the WWH show. This is a show that asks a series of why, what, and how questions on topics that have national, regional, and international implications and significance. Today we're going to talk about that kind of thing, which is why freedom of press is key to the health of a society. To talk about this theme, I have Andy Kowl. He is a journalist and entrepreneurial publisher who has spent more than 40 years developing and growing publishing companies. At the start of his career in the late 1960s and early 70s, he launched an underground newspaper for Long Island, New York, which has harassed and raided by local police. In 1974, he launched High Times, a highly controversial and highly successful national magazine that created brand new tests for the US press freedom laws. Currently, Andy is Senior Vice President of Publishing Strategy for ePublishing Inc., the leading enterprise publishing system provider. His company helps hundreds of publications with systems that manage content, audience data, workflow, newsletters, and e-commerce. He also writes for Publishing Executive magazine. Andy, thank you very much for coming. You are a very busy person. There's so many things to do within a day, but you took your time. You came here to share your experience and story. So thank you very much for being here.
I am honored to be here, especially once I realized that the topic of your show this week so profoundly affects your country. So I am very honored to be part of that conversation.
Yeah, because, ISAT is a community organization that has been persecuted by the government in Ethiopia. They tried to take it off from the air for more than a dozen times, but the organization persisted. It's a revolutionary company, organization like you. You are a revolutionary for me. So we want to create parallel between what you have been doing for the freedom of press and what kind of lessons we should learn from your experience, from your own stories as you have been struggling to achieve freedom of press. So my first question is, why freedom of press is key to the health of a society?
From an American perspective, it's almost a difficult question because we take it for granted. Freedom of press was one of the cornerstones of the founding of the United States in 1776 when we had a revolutionary war, and unfortunately, as history tells us, often freedom of the press needs a revolution. That's unfortunate. So as an American, it's critical for us to be open with ideas, and I believe the open exchange of ideas has helped our country grow the way it has.
So I'm going to give you some data before I ask you the next question. Ethiopia is not free, according to Freedom House's Freedom in the World 2015 Index. CPJ, which is Committee to Protect Journalists, revealed that Ethiopia has produced most exiled journalists. CPJ also ranked Ethiopia one of the top 10 censored countries in the world. And Human Rights Watch, they reported that since 2010, 60 Ethiopian journalists have fled into exile, including 30 in 2014 alone. Another 19 or more journalists languish in jail. Government harassment and intimidation caused at least 6 independent publications to close in 2014. Now, this is a government that's saying that they want to transform this country from poverty into prosperity, but at the same time they restrain free press. So the question is, why restraining the free press also affects the socio-economical and cultural aspects of the country? I'm asking that because when people are repressed, they are not creative. They don't, become innovative. And also, when you repress free press, what happens is that corruption, injustice, conflict gonna flourish, and that affects the overall health of that society. So would you please show us why restraining the free press is not really for the benefit of a society or even a government that claims to transform a country from poverty to prosperity?
You know, I think the best answer starts a couple hundred years ago, not with the U.S. Revolution, although that wasn't bad, but with the French. And I don't remember how this came about, but have you ever heard of the Fourth Estate? Does that name mean anything to you, the Fourth Estate? So the Fourth Estate means the media, means the press, journalists. And the way it came about was the First Estate was considered in this, believe it was 1700s, the First Estate was considered, I wrote it down not to forget, the clergy was the First Estate. Nobility, the leaders, the government, that was the Second Estate. And the commoners, you know, the people, were the Third Estate. There were three estates as defined by France. When the printing press was invented and then became a commercial entity where you could actually print multiple copies of publications or even of sheets of paper, then the Fourth Estate was defined as the press. What's interesting to me is that 200 years ago, the French looked at the Fourth Estate in a sense on equal footing with the clergy, the government, and the people. That's how important the press can be in a society. So if you take away the ability to be honest and truthful, the importance goes away too.
Yeah. So it's very important for a government to give space to its press freedom, even if it's a little bit challenging to the government, because sometimes, you know, the free press may talk about some of the faulty policies and workings of that the same government. So it's a kind of like a blessing in disguise.
I think with all respect to your country, and my understanding is we're talking to the people here, yes, if you will, the Third Estate. So no disrespect meant, but it's quite simple. Any government that claims that they have the benefit of the people in mind, yet they do not let the people have a free exchange of ideas, then that government is a liar.
Yes.
It's simply not true. It doesn't go together. Who's deciding what people can say in the first place? You know that it's arbitrary, and it's also it's self-interest motivated. So they're trying to protect their franchise and to not have the people kick them out of office, essentially. That's as big as it gets. If you have the ability to criticize the government, we find in America that it really solves a lot of problems. Yeah, the people who are being criticized aren't happy about it. However, as a society, it lets it out. It gets it spoken about. It doesn't build up into a revolutionary situation.
Exactly. Now the situation in Ethiopia is heading that direction, because the more you repress people and put cap on their expression of freedom, then at the end of the day you may experience revolution, conflict, even war, conflict of interest between the people and the government, between different parts of the country and so on. But there is one question: why does the press deserve any more freedom than other? For example, there are hospitals, there are police, and so on, essential parts of a society. Why free press deserves a little bit better freedom than other entities of a country, and why should any government allow to be criticized by the free press?
I think that's a critical question. And it's a great example, for example, hospitals and healthcare regulations or standards. There are certain, for example, here in this country, probably in yours as well, that drugs have to be approved. They go through a rigorous approval process. Certain procedures are only allowed for certain health issues. And my understanding is it's doctors and medical boards and medical colleges that decide that. And in a way, it's straightforward. Whereas, so the regulations, I'm sure there's always someone who disagrees with them, but at least there's a logical reason. Whereas in the free exchange of ideas, any regulation, the question is, who's regulating it?
Yes.
Everybody has a self-interest. Now, once you allow everybody to print or broadcast or put on the internet their own ideas, their own criticisms, their own facts, and journalistic facts especially, then at least you get a chance to debate it and find out what's best. There is no individual in that case who knows better. Now, some think they do, whereas I'd be willing to believe that there are some doctors that know a lot better than me about what should be done in a hospital. I don't think there's anybody in America that knows more than me or you as to what we should or should not print.
I think that's very convincing, because nobody should be there to censor and say, okay, this one is perfect. But what happens if, for example, some publications or some media lies, or if they lie, or if they misprint or produce something that may damage, for example, another person or the integrity of an institution and so on? Because if we just let it free, there may be some errors or some misprints and so on, and that also affects. So when we say free press, it doesn't mean that it is above the law.
Well, in our country, free press is the law. It's not above the law, it is the law. And so people lie all the time. In everyday life, people lie. I have read easily more than 100 journalistically accurate articles, or articles that were not influenced by anybody other than the writer or the reporter, where I knew everybody in the story and I knew the whole story, because either I was there or I was close to the story. I've never once agreed with any one of those articles. Never once. Because I always said, oh, well, that guy didn't say something, or no, I saw that and that's not exactly how it looked. But guess what? In that case, it may not have been a lie. It was just everybody has a different perception. That's okay. That's okay. Now, there are, as far as lying towards people, so if I say John Smith is a murderer, or beats his wife, we do have laws in this country about that. They're called slander and libel laws, and that person could sue me. It's not easy. It's expensive, but the laws are in place. That's for malicious lies. However, we have a lot of political factions, for example. The U.S. is really more divided in some ways than in any part of my lifetime, where we have the right wing and the left wing and the different parties. And I could tell you there are fringe, in my opinion, what I would call fringe journals in both areas that make stuff up, that absolutely lie. But so what? After what? The people who read it, willing to believe it before they even read it, they're going to believe it, and their mind isn't going to change them, even if they read the other side of the story. Whereas enough time, if a newspaper or radio station or TV station wants to be taken seriously, and if they lie often enough, people will just turn them off, because people always know better. I've seen that. They always know better. The facts always come out if you're allowed to get them out.
So you prefer the free press to have that freedom of its own life and things will sort out, rather than deciding that we need someone to really tell us what to say, what not to say, and so on. Right?
Well, I've been lied about in the press, and guess what? It didn't make me happy, but there's nothing. There's, again, going back to the French, but it's the quote about the free press, and you probably know it. Voltaire, French writer, again, around the time of the 1700s. And the famous quote was, "I disagree with what you say, but I defend to the death your right to say it." Now, I'll be honest with you, AZ, before I came to the show, I looked up who said that quote. I had in mind that it was an American that said that quote. I'll admit it. I thought it was someone during the Revolutionary War. No, it was a Frenchman, and I think that's a universal feeling.
Could you please say it again, the quote?
"I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it.
Wow. This should have been said, for example, by the Ethiopian government. I may disagree what you write, you guys, free press, but I will defend your rights because a government is there to protect the rights of its citizens. Now the government, when it is trying to muzzle and stop people from expressing what they feel about the government's policies, what it does, it means it's taking away their freedom, that birthright of expressing their opinion and expressions.
Yeah, I mean,
the
here
government should have defended that.
You know, here in Washington, D.C., we have one of the top newspapers in the world, the Washington Post, and I don't know how many of your viewers know about Watergate.
Yes, I heard
It was in the 70s, in the early 70s, when our president Richard Nixon was involved in a scandal because he was trying to undermine the other party in our constitutional election process. And he sent in people to break into the headquarters of the opposition party. And over the course of the next couple of years, it was a non-story until two journalists in the Washington Post started to get the story. And they started writing articles, and the more they wrote, other people who knew about it would contact them, or they would find these people. And within 2 years, the president had to resign. Now, we're lucky that changed our government, but we're lucky here. That is completely unusual. It's the only time it's ever happened. And in other countries, it would have been worse than resignation. In other countries, there would have been blood on the streets.
Definitely, definitely. Yeah, that's why, my next question is about what took, for example, the free press of the United States to reach this height. Would you please give us some milestones about the history and the evolution of the free press in the United States?
What's interesting about that is that in a way, the evolution was minor. It was a revolution. It was one of the basic reasons that the United States, who your listeners may know had been owned by Britain, it wasn't called United Kingdom in those days, by England, and the English king ruled America. And at some point in time, the Americans said enough. Now, there were a lot of reasons for that. But during that time, when the Americans who were angry at the king started writing, the Federalist Papers were a famous group of revolutionary papers that the king tried to suppress and get people to raid shops and burn and imprison people who distributed these. So that became one of the founding principles of this country. So where we got happened from day one, that we have what's called the First Amendment, where we have freedom of the press. Since then, as any country, trends change, people's attitudes change. Undoubtedly there were places and times in America where there were different publications that ran into legal problems like mine. But by comparison to what I would guess might happen in Ethiopia, but certainly we know in Russia right now, we know that if you write something against Vladimir Putin, the president, that is not a way to a long life. We know that they have followed journalists to London and killed them in London. We know that in China, right now, you don't want to be writing against the country, whether it's writing on the internet or any which way. And in fact, recently, meaning the last year or so, the U.S. has accused China of sending spies over, sending agents to kill, to warn, first of all, to kill people here, which they have not yet done, but more importantly, to warn individuals, perhaps like people here at this station, I don't want to put any thoughts in anybody's mind, that we know where your family lives in China in that case. Mm-hmm. And if you continue to write, these are Chinese journalists writing from America where it was relatively safe, they're being told that their families may end up in concentration camps or worse if they continue to write about China. So, whereas the growth in America of the free press, compared to a lot of that, was fairly painless. We did have a time in the early 20th century, we had something called the yellow press. Now, the yellow press was when, the technology in those days had gotten large enough that large newspapers could be printed and distributed around the country, And we had in the early 20th century, there was a famous newspaper man here called William Randolph Hearst, who ran newspapers with his own political point of view. And something had happened in Cuba where a couple of Americans were killed, I believe. Anyway, the publisher, Hearst, is credited with starting the Spanish-American War, that the United States went to war with Spain in South America based on lies printed in the newspaper, based on exaggerations. There was a kernel of truth, and they blew it out of proportion to sell newspapers. They made it sound much worse, the yellow press. We survived that. People died in that war. So it was never always easy, and there's always a lot of reasons why the other side thinks they should ban pornography, certain things like that we might touch on.
So what kind of lessons we learn as Europeans from the history of the United States free press?
Well, first of all, it's not always easy. It's not always a clear-cut path. It seems to me that the countries who have the freest press, be it the U.S., Canada, United Kingdom, France, Germany, well, what do they have in common? They're some of the most successful countries on the face of the planet. That's not a coincidence. The fact that there's a free exchange of ideas, and people can argue with each other and can call each other names or, criticize what they're doing in newspapers, on the air, whatever, has obviously not been a negative factor on those countries. Now, clearly it has not kept certain governments in power, but those countries had developed, with exceptions along the way, a history of having open government.
So we should learn a lot of things, because initially I mentioned in the introduction that your newspaper, or it was that magazine that was raided by local police. So we came out of that as...
Well, that was an aberration. Let me tell you about that. When I grew up in the 50s and 60s, the culture of the planet was different, but of the United States was very, people didn't question things quite so much. We'd come out of World War II where everybody was united in the war effort. And it wasn't, although there would, politicians would always question each other, but people pretty much went along with everything that was out there. Now, all of a sudden came the Cultural Revolution. It came out of prosperity, truthfully, what we call the baby boomers, people like myself who were born after World War II. All of a sudden, there was more prosperity here. Overall, parents were making more money, less pressures on kids to work, truthfully. And then combined with the fact that we had, in my opinion, a horrible war going on in Vietnam, and people like me were able to be drafted. Well, I had no interest or intention of going to fight in Vietnam for what I felt was a corrupt war. So that got us demonstrating. And that matched the time of open social mores, where rock and roll, critical stuff. I believe rock and roll brought down the Iron Curtain more than Ronald Reagan ever did. I'm convinced if the Beatles and Rolling Stones had not penetrated the Iron Curtain, it would have taken a decade longer to come down. But having rock and roll, experimenting with drugs, smoking marijuana, doing other illegal drugs. But all of a sudden, we were growing our hair, we were protesting the war. Now, it wasn't that the newspapers were not allowed to cover this, they did. But the point of view they had was from an establishment point of view. So here we were, a bunch of kids, literally, I was a teenager when I started my first newspaper, and we were against the war, and we were against people who repressed gay rights, and we were for women's rights. It was called women's liberation, is what it was called in those days. And these were all topics that the press covered, but we made it all about what we did. So in the county that our paper was published, the local politicians were not thrilled about us being the newspaper who were, and by the way, we also had a lot of fun, and there was a lot of humor involved. So they didn't want this newspaper with all these crazy ideas. They were concerned, but there was nothing they could do about it. So what happened was after a few weeks, for a while, they would pull over myself and I had two partners, like every day. The police would pull us over every day, and they would just want to see our license, where you going, not that I would tell them, just to let us know they were watching, clearly, because it was no coincidence. All of a sudden, every day, we were all being pulled over, me and my two partners. Then, a week or so later, each week the paper came out, and we had volunteers who were distributing the paper in college campuses and record shops. And there were record shops in the old days, all sorts of other stores and boutiques. And all of a sudden, so my staff was together, ready to disperse the newspaper. In those days, we put it in everybody's car. This guy would drive here, this girl would drive there. And all of a sudden, the police swooped down. They lined us up in front of the office. And one of them got into our truck, which was full of newspapers, and started looking around. Now, all there were newspapers in the truck, but I knew my rights. So I said, "What are you doing in the truck?" I was the publisher of the paper. I was like 19. "What are you doing in the truck?" He said, whatever he said. I said, "Get out. Unless you have a warrant, get out of my truck." And he was like, "Well," I said, "Get out." And he had to get out. Now, there's other places I might have been shot, I suppose, in other countries. Yeah. But fortunately, so the problems I had, by comparison to some of the problems that your countrymen have, I almost am embarrassed to tell you about them. But to us,
in the United States,
you know, I was willing to go to jail that day. If he had said, "Look, I'm not getting out, I'm going to put you in jail," I knew my rights. I knew eventually I'd be okay.
But it's unthinkable, you know, compared to where we are in terms of free press in the United States. Now, in our country,
but that was like a blip. Truthfully.
But in Ethiopia right now, people are jailed just because, you know, what you did back in the days. They were just saying, "We don't approve," or "We don't support ethnic politics," or "We don't support this policy because it affects the long run interest of the country." Yeah. People were not out there, you know, violent or trying to kill people or defame people. No, they were just expressing their disapproval of faulty policies and some of the corruptions that have been affecting the business and the life of the country and so on. But in return, what happens in Ethiopia is that they're going to be jailed or pushed out from the country to go to exile. So it's very severe.
But let me talk about, you mentioned corruption. I think that's critical, because one of the reasons, in my view, that the repressive governments don't want a free press is because what always comes with repressive governments is graft and corruption. Always. Or have you heard the term a kleptocracy? As opposed to democracy, kleptocracy. Yeah. I'll tell you a few. A kleptocracy is a government built on stealing from the people. And for example,
that's the kind of government we have.
Okay, it likely is, and usually it goes hand in hand. So all of a sudden, for example, we had a scandal here in the United States. The CEO, the leader of the largest airline in America, was caught giving graft, and he resigned immediately because he knew what was coming in the press. If he hadn't resigned, it would have really hurt his company and his family and himself. So he got out of there. He'll still have problems. But imagine if we couldn't talk about that. Then all of a sudden, who knows what else would have gone on? And we know that graft and corruption and people lining their own government officials lining their own pockets is a big problem in many parts of the world. And that's why a free press scares them, because they want to be stealing money quietly.
Exactly. By the way, those leaders in Ethiopia, for example, who are against the free press are the corrupt one. Otherwise, I believe that there are many government officials, genuine, who want to serve the country and its people. But those handfuls of few leaders who are corrupt, these are the leaders that are persecuting the press. Now, let's talk about the major factors that may contribute toward this creating a vibrant free press and free society. What are the major factors? For example, if in case the government in Ethiopia or the future government of Ethiopia would like to establish a vibrant free press and free society, what are the couple of, those couple of...
Well, let me tell you, the factors have changed, because when I was younger, there was a famous journalist in the U.S. called A.J. Liebling, before my time, who said, freedom of the press belongs to those who own one. Freedom of the press belongs to those who own one, because in those days, you did need a printing press. That was how people communicated. There was no radio stations. I've been in the radio business. TV didn't exist. It was about printing. So there was a high cost of entry. You needed either to literally own a printing press, or more likely to be able to pay for the printing and the paper and the distribution necessary. So to get back to your question, but right now it's easier. What's one thing that is that everybody now has the possibility? Here we're broadcasting, I guess against government wishes perhaps, but we have the internet. So the barrier of entry is much lower. And so one of the things that I learned, for example, in the national magazine I had, when we first came up with this magazine, it was so controversial. Printers, we were turned down by about 50 printing presses. They were afraid to print it. There were 7 major national distributors of magazines in the United States at that time. None of them would distribute it. Now, coincidentally, they were distributing what you might call pornography, but certainly, magazines full of naked women mostly doing all sorts of things. That they were comfortable with. But the controversial ideas that we were coming up with, which was mostly, by the way, about marijuana and legalizing drugs, that they didn't want to handle because it had never been touched before. So the fact that now one does not need necessarily distributors and printing presses makes it better. But yeah, so I might have lost track of where we were going with that one, AZ.
Let's go forward and address this question. What are the commercial factors that affect free press, and what roles should business play in the free press?
I think the commercial factors for many countries are as important, and in some countries they're intertwined, like we talked about. If the government is the industry, well, that's the same thing. The commercial factors, for one thing, for example, when I was a kid, I was talking about the newspapers not covering like the revolutionary ideas we have. Well, guess what? They didn't have the space. Even though they were far more successful then, before there was the internet, there were so many pages. They had a certain number of pages for sports and certain pages for local activities, and then they had certain pages for, business and government. Well, when you were done with that, and having been an editor for all my life, that's real. You only have so much space. So how much space could they have printed about things of interest to me? Not that much, because that's not what people were reading about. So just having the space to do it. Now, there's an odd backward commercial factor in a way for repression. I would think that if indeed someone was printing different ideas, they don't have to be radical, they don't have to be revolution, but perhaps ideas that are not sanctioned, that in a way, oddly enough, if that person's not repressed, then maybe they're not doing a good enough commercial job of getting those ideas out. Exactly. You could almost be insulted. Why aren't they attacking me? Aren't I? But so there's that. Commercially, another thing is advertising, because a lot of the media is advertising supported. So the question comes up, will advertisers support what anybody writes about in any particular case? And that has both good and bad effects. There's other ways to get around that, but what advertiser support is important, because people do have to live, and even if it's a broadcast show, you need cameras. There's money. There's always money somewhere that's involved to get things done. So the commercial support is also important.
What about technology? How technology affects the free press, especially the advancement of technology?
Well, again, that's the good news, is that technology makes free press almost unstoppable. Now, I know that some countries are able to cut off parts of the internet. We know this.
In our country, for example, they block all the diaspora Ethiopian websites. So people in Ethiopia, they don't have access, for example, to our website, the ISAT website.
And they have to work around if they're able to. Right. So generally speaking, barrier of entry is low. Anybody can write on the internet and have global distribution. Like I said a moment ago, it doesn't mean that everybody's going to read them, because people may not even be able to find them with no repression. Just because it doesn't mean because you put it on the internet that everybody can find it. However, it does make it a lot more available. So I believe the fact that you could do a broadcast here from Washington and get it to Ethiopia, there's the best example of how technology can begin to break down barriers. In the long run, I have no doubt that there's not a government on earth that can truly stop all aspects of the free press. Now, whereas earlier, without the technology we have today, now there's podcasts, that never heard of a podcast 10 years ago. Apps didn't exist 8 years ago. So these are all communication channels that now have opened up. So technology is huge to get out the word.
Let's talk about how journalists and activists could forge unity and fight repression in terms of defending the free press. What do you suggest to them, to journalists and activists, towards having a free press in our country?
I think I've seen a lot of great examples of that. Part of it's called citizen journalism nowadays. Now, citizen journalism is really a 21st century version, in a way, of our what we called underground journalism in my day. So you have, and then there's the view of everybody's a publisher. Now, I was proud coming up, being a publisher, and calling myself a publisher because I simply published a lot of newspapers, magazines, and books. So I've been a publisher, whereas now anybody can publish. That bothers me a little bit, but I realized about 10 or a dozen years ago that I really had always been more than a publisher, an information distributor, because I used to produce live events. Again, that's getting information to people. Radio, I had a national radio network, a syndicated radio show of getting out information in that way. But I got lost, Daisy. Where were we going with this question again?
The question was what kind of things, for example, journalists and activists.
Yeah, so I think the citizen journalism movement, I think, is important, and the fact that we're all carrying a camera in our pocket. Now, my understanding is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, what I hear in my publishing conferences is that in Africa, they made a leap past computers to phones, because I gather there were only so many laptops and desktop computers on your continent, but now the internet is on everybody's phone. So that I gather that has far greater penetration. So the fact that everybody can now record an injustice that's happening in front of us, happening right here in this country, where there are police actions that are where they're hurting individuals, and someone will take a video, it'll be on TV, and all of a sudden now it's known. And I believe that's critical. Now, it's critical to do, but I do want to speak to your listeners and viewers. I don't want to tell anybody to go out and get themselves killed doing this. Let me be clear. As much as I can quote Voltaire about defend to the death, I'm not telling anybody you're a bad person if you're not defending this to your death, whoever you are. That said, if one has an interest, I think it behooves them and their family and their country to become a citizen journalist when possible. Now, here in this country, I have seen some established newspapers, and really this is a commercial aspect, because part of it is that a lot of them have had to cut their staffs drastically. We had newspapers across the country that would have bureaus in London and Cairo and Johannesburg and places like that. Nobody can afford, not nobody, but people can't afford that anymore. So they are collaborating with local journalists, in some cases student journalists, where I've seen teams of students now working with established journalists to get out more information than it would have been possible for those journalists to get out. And part of that's a commercial factor, but to your point, it could easily be a freedom of the press factor as well. It would have the same purpose, with the same effect.
Yeah, what about the roles of the international community in terms of forging forces with local journalists and other activists to help flourish, for example, free press in the countries like Ethiopia and other countries where there is no freedom of press?
Well, do you get broadcasts in Ethiopia of Radio Free America? Does that make it through? No. They block that? They blocked that. Voice of America, yeah. So part of what I'm sure that our country has had a program, and they still do, called Voice of America, Radio Free America, where we will broadcast in countries in their own language, in their native language, and we will have native speakers, usually from that country, are the ones who are broadcasters. So that's one type of international collaboration. I suspect other countries do that. I don't know. I know that during the World War II, famously in our country, the Japanese would broadcast to U.S. soldiers fighting in Asia that, oh, Americans, you're going to lose, this and that. So they would be, it was the other side of the coin. So cross-border journalism, obviously, if your life will be in jeopardy producing facts in any given country, probably international cooperation is about the only way to get it across. But of course, countries, any country, has only so many resources, not just dollars, but time and, you know, and so many things to think about. So is every country going to help the journalists of every other country? Unlikely. But I think, fortunately, as you know, there are some terrific groups out there that do try to bring people together
in the fight against the repression of free press. I really enjoyed our discussion about the importance of freedom of expression for the health of a society, and our society needs freedom of speech, freedom of press, and so on. I enjoyed our discussion. Is there anything you would like to say to our audience? Last minute.
You know, to me, there's nothing more critical. I've dedicated my whole life to this, to the press. Most of the time, not to freedom of the press, because I took that for granted, and truthfully, I still pretty much take it for granted, except for a day like today, when I appreciate getting the chance to be reminded of how profound that is. Unfortunately, I don't think a society can ever grow to realize its full potential. I don't believe for a second any society, any country can realize its full potential if people are not allowed an open exchange of ideas, and certainly if the government is not allowed to be criticized. Of course, we know that a lot of times that results in governments, those are the governments who never want to leave power. Longer story, but we understand why they want to keep power. We get that they don't want to leave office because they're lining their own pockets, and I don't know if Ethiopia, but in many places, it's so important, the open exchange of ideas, and I thank you for bringing this up, and I'm doing my best to share some ideas with you.
Thank you very much for coming, and I look forward also to have another meeting and discussion on another topic. Thank you for
Great, my pleasure. Thank you.
Dear our viewers, this is my hope that you enjoyed our discussion. As you heard, Andy was saying that no country could be able to tap into its full potential without allowing the free expression of ideas of its citizens. So I call upon all Ethiopians to understand the importance of expressing ideas, pushing the government and other responsible institutions to open up and allow people to exchange free ideas. And also I encourage journalists and other activists to express their ideas and make sure that our country keep on growing in terms of allowing freedom of press. Contribute your share, write, express yourself, and at the end of the day we may be able to have a government that understands the importance of free press. Thank you very much for watching.